Hello, my name is Daniel Sobing. I am the project manager on the Columbia Corridor and Industrial Lands Environmental Overlay Zone project. This is a project that is intended to modify and update the application of environmental overlay zones and to amend the requirements and zoning code provisions that apply to the environmental overlay zones. And this is a project that is being coordinated with a citywide economic opportunities analysis. This is the project area that's covered by the Columbia Corridor and Industrial Lands Environmental Overlay Zone project. I'll refer to it from here on out as the CCIL ezone project. These are areas that are primarily industrially zoned, but there are also some adjacent commercial and residential areas that are nearby industrial areas in the city of Portland. So, the City of Portland has environmental overlay zones primarily to comply with statewide land use planning goal 5, which requires jurisdictions to identify natural resources, determine which natural resources are significant, and come up with a strategy to protect certain natural resources that have been identified as being significant. The city of Portland adopted a number of different natural resource protection plans and was deemed by the state to be in compliance with statewide land use planning goal 5 as of 2004. Subsequent to that, Metro, the regional planning government that covers the Metro region, including Multnomah County, Washington County, and Clackamas County, and the city of Portland, Metro applied additional natural resource protection requirements under that Goal 5 program in 2006. Their Goal 5, their Natural Resource Protection Plan that was adopted by Metro is known as Title 13, Nature and Neighborhoods, and all jurisdictions within Metro need to come into compliance with Metro Title 13. Portland demonstrated and was deemed to be in substantial compliance with Title 13 as of 2012. And in 2013, the city of Portland and Metro entered into a intergovernmental agreement that committed the city of Portland to do additional planning work for additional natural resource protections, including in the north reach of the Willamette River and in the Columbia Corridor at some point in the future. And then also, we have a biological opinion that has been issued by NOAA Fisheries regarding FEMA's management of the National Flood Insurance Program, which the City of Portland is a participant in. The National Flood Insurance Program provides discounted flood insurance to constituents in jurisdictions that participate in the program. However, in 2016, there was a lawsuit that was brought against that program, and the biological opinion determined that the way that the program was being administered in the state of Oregon was not adequately protective of threatened and endangered species of salmon and steelhead. And so, based on that biological opinion, Portland and other jurisdictions in the state of Oregon are required to apply environmental protections to the floodplain in ways that weren't previously applied before. And so, the CCIL ezone project includes some provisions that will protect the floodplain consistent with that biological opinion. So E-zones, as I said previously, are natural resource protections. And how do they protect resources? Well, they apply limits to new disturbance areas within those E-zones. They apply limits on the amount of trees, the number of trees, and the quantity of trees that can be removed within the E-zones. They require setbacks from water features, wetlands, and streams. And there are mitigation requirements to offset the impacts of development when development is allowed. There are two kinds of environmental overlay zones. The first is the conservation zone, which is the more permissive of the E-zones. Within the conservation zone, there are required setbacks, disturbance area limits, tree removal limits. However, these limits can be reduced or adjusted when applicants go through environmental review. So the conservation zone is more permissive because you can adjust those limits that are applied. The protection zone is not very permissive at all. It's actually very restrictive of new development, particularly private development. The protection zone allows no adjustments or variances. And so for most private development, the protection zone effectively serves as a no-build area. So why are environmental overlay zones being updated? The E-zones were first adopted through a number of area-specific natural resource protection plans that were adopted starting in the late 80s, and many of some of the ones that are still in effect were adopted in the 1990s. So a lot of these plans are fairly old and not consistent with best practices that are now in effect in most areas. So we have a long history of protecting natural resources, and we've been working on updating those natural resource protections in recent years. And we do that because we now have access to higher definition aerial imagery that allows us to map where the natural resources are more effectively. We also have access to LiDAR terrain mapping, which allows us to see the ground in high detail, even through the forest canopy. And that allows us to map streams and slopes and other aspects of the terrain much more effectively than we could previously. And we've also generated a lot of on-the-ground knowledge through doing site visits and just the way the city staff work in these areas. We understand the resources were not mapped adequately previously. And the types of resources that we're talking about is map vegetation, so forest vegetation, herbaceous vegetation, woodlands and shrubs, shrublands. We also map wetlands, streams, and floodplains. So these are all factors that we factor into where environmental zones should be applied. And these are things that we generate that information through the factors on the left: site visits, LiDAR terrain mapping, and aerial imagery. This graphic details some of the work that we've been doing to update our natural resource protections over the last decade. So we treat the Willamette River different than the rest of the city because there's a different statewide land use planning goal that applies to it. So we do certain types of natural resource protection plans that apply to the Willamette River, and then other types that apply to other parts of Portland. We updated natural resource protections in the central reach and south reach of the Willamette River. Both of those plans went into effect in 2020. We then did a project that applied to environmental overlay zones throughout the majority of the city that was adopted in 2022. That project excluded the industrial areas and areas that are adjacent to industrial areas. We did a floodplain protection plan that was adopted in 2023. And like I said, there's some additional flood protections that are incorporated into this project as well. And now we're working on the CCIL ezone project, which we hope to go into effect in 2026. And then down the road, in the not too distant future, we'll be doing a North Reach plan to address the North Reach of the Willamette River. So this project, we're doing in conjunction with a citywide economic opportunity analysis. And as part of that partnership, we are looking at some different scenarios for natural resource protections to look at different levels of protection that we could apply. So we start with a natural resource inventory. This was adopted by City Council in 2012. It's a methodology for mapping natural resources. The methodology that we use is consistent with State of Oregon and Metro methodologies for mapping natural resources. This document contains a ranking system that we use to determine the relative ranking of riparian resources and wildlife habitat. And it also includes a mapping of special habitat areas, which are areas that have been identified to provide habitat for at-risk and endangered species. This slide compares how riparian resources are mapped by the city of Portland. On the left, that's the NRI classification system for riparian resources. And then on the right, you can see the Metro classification for riparian resources. The importance here is that our classification system is largely consistent with how Metro classifies natural resources. And typically, we are looking at medium and high ranking resources. We most often apply protections to those types of features. And those are the types of features that Metro requires us to protect, those medium and high ranking riparian resources. And what I mean by that is we identify buffers around streams and wetlands. We look to see what is within that buffer. If it's undeveloped area, within 50 feet of that feature, we'd say that's a medium ranking resource because it's an area where the resources could be enhanced theoretically. Herbaceous and bare soil, we also look at that as a medium ranking resource within 50 feet. whereas shrublands, woodlands, and forests, those are providing functions and benefits to those riparian features, even when it's further away from the resource itself. So when it's forest, we're ranking resources up to 100 feet away from that water feature. And again, typically we apply environmental overlay zones to those areas that are identified as ranking resources. So how do we protect these resources? Well, we typically apply an ezone to the feature, and then we apply a buffer around that feature. And we have ways of tweaking our protection scenarios that are more or less protective of the natural resources. So the first decision we make is, do we apply a conservation zone to this resource or a protection zone? Protection zone, like I said, is much more restrictive. It's more protective. Conservation zone is less protective because it's less restrictive of new development. So that's a policy decision that we make. Do we apply a protection zone to it or a conservation zone? The other policy decision that's factored into our scenarios is the size of the buffers around the features. Do we apply a buffer to it at all? And if so, how big should that buffer be? A larger buffer is more protective. A smaller buffer is less protective. So that's the way we craft these scenarios. Is we vary whether it's conservation zone or protection zone that's applied to a type of feature, and then we vary how big those buffers are. So we have three scenarios that we are reviewing as part of this project, and we hope to come up with a proposal for one specific scenario as we move forward with the project. And so these scenarios are intended to show a range from low to high in terms of the level of protection of natural resources. We've got some terminology that we apply to these scenarios. So the lowest protection scenario is what we deem the minimum compliance scenario. These are intended to be E-zones that are doing the minimum level of protection that's required to comply with our state and regional planning goals. But they are not as protective as they could be of the resources in some of those higher scenarios. And so we apply conservation zone to only the high ranking riparian resources. We have 30-foot conservation buffers that extend from the edge of the resources. And then the resources themselves are within the protection zone, but that protection zone does not extend beyond the banks of the streams, and it does not extend outside of wetlands. So in the low scenario, development would typically be allowed right up to the edge of the natural resource of the water features. And some wetlands would be left in the conservation zone in that scenario. A higher level of protection is our medium scenario, which we've also termed our climate resilient scenario. This in the climate resilient scenario would be applying conservation zone to high and medium ranking resources. In the low scenario, we only applied the conservation zone to high ranking resources. And then we would be applying, again, wetlands to all streams, sloughs, and most wetlands. And in that medium scenario, there would be a 25-foot protection zone buffer that would extend from the edge of that feature. So there would be a 25-foot no-build area that would extend from the banks of the slough and from the edges of those wetlands that are close to streams. And then in the maximum scenario, we're again protecting all high and medium ranking riparian resources with conservation zone. In that scenario, there would be 50-foot buffers around the streams, sloughs, and wetlands. And in that scenario, P-zone protection zone would be applied to all wetlands, whereas the other scenarios would exclude some lower value wetlands. So how good of a job do these different scenarios do of covering the natural resources that we believe we are required to be protecting based on our state and regional regulations? This slide is intended to show that, to compare the existing E-zones that were applied, remember, more than 30 years ago in many cases, to these different scenarios that we're looking at. So the existing E-zones, they covered 6,471 acres of high and medium ranking riparian resources. We have more than 7,000 acres in the whole area. So there's a gap. So there's more than 700, more than 800 acres of high and medium ranking riparian resources are missed by those existing E-zones. And so in these other scenarios, we'd be kind of filling that gap. We'd be covering more of those resources that we have mapped that we know are out there. So the minimum scenario, that low scenario, we're now covering 95% of those resources that are high and medium ranking. In each of the higher scenarios, the climate resilient and that maximum scenario, we'd be covering very close to 100% of those resources. The main differences between the climate resilient and that maximum scenario is the amount of protection zone would be applying. In that maximum scenario, there's more protection zone, relatively speaking. And you'll notice that both climate resilient and maximum, neither of them are 100%, and that's because there are some high and medium ranking riparian resources that are within the airport, which is within our project area, and we don't apply e-zones to the airport because we have an agreement with the Port of Portland to not apply resources there or to not apply e-zones there in the airport. In exchange, the Port of Portland does some mitigations elsewhere to compensate for the fact that resources are being impacted within the airport. So we are coordinating this project with the economic opportunities analysis. And the economic opportunities analysis, or EOA, is a project that we as the city of Portland do to demonstrate that we are complying with statewide land use planning goal 9. Goal 9 requires jurisdictions to ensure that we have adequate land capacity for future job growth out for the next 20 years. And so to make that determination, that demonstration, we analyze trends and market factors. So we look at how development has been happening in the recent past in Portland. We use some growth forecasts that come from the state and from Metro and from our region and from our local analysis to determine how our population is going to grow, and based on these market trends, how much of the jobs that our future population are going to have are going to be in different market sectors, and how much land is going to be needed to for that future growth that we're anticipating. And so we look at policy choices that allow us to meet those growth projections that we are making based on market trends and population growth projections. And so we are looking at a variety of different job types, economic sectors. So we look at commercial, we look at institutional, educational, and we also look at industrial and commercial as well. I believe I left that out. But industrial is one sector where we expect to see significant growth over the next 20 years. Roughly a third of Portland's future job growth is going to go into the industrial sector. Those industrial jobs are important because they provide relatively high wage employment, at least in the middle wage category. And they are jobs that are easily accessible to people that don't have high levels of educational attainment, so they don't require college degrees. And so we expect to see relatively significant growth in those industrial sectors. A lot of that growth will be coming in new land development, so in land that's zoned for industrial uses that's currently undeveloped that will be developed in the future. And there will also be significant job growth in the industrial sectors that will come from the intensification of uses within currently developed land. So sites that have industrial buildings, industrial lots that have current uses will see the growth in those buildings or growth in the amount of people that are employed on those sites. So based on our analysis in terms of the need for expansion of industrial areas into previously undeveloped land, it looks like there's a demand for about 1,100 acres of new industrial development over the next 20 years. And so one of the things that we do in the EOA is we look to see, do we have the land in the city of Portland that can meet those job growth needs? So we have on this graphic here, you can see all the land in Portland that's zoned for industrial uses. It's all the land that's shaded in gray on this graphic here. And I've overlaid on top of that the project area for the Columbia Corridor Industrial Lands Project. So the project area is about 16,000 acres in total. And then within that, we're only looking in the next graphic at sites that are zoned, that are both zoned for industrial land and that are identified as being tax lots. And a tax lot is a unit of land that can be individually owned and developed. Distinguished from tax lots as land that's not a tax lot, which could be right of way. So the roads are not within tax lots. The slough is oftentimes an area that's outside of a tax lot, and the Columbia River is outside of a tax lot. So that accounts for that distinction, because there's a lot of land within the project area that's not privately owned, not in a tax lot. So the next graphic we're going to look at This is looking just at land that is both within a tax lot and zoned for industrial uses. And we're again comparing the existing E-zones to these different scenarios in terms of the coverage of these sites. So existing E-zones, there's about 1,000 acres that are covered by existing E-zones within those tax lots that are zoned for industrial uses. It's about 16% because there's about 7,000 acres that are tax lots that are zoned for industrial uses. The minimum scenario, you'd see an increase from 16% of that lot area covered would go up to 18%. And then in those, the climate resilient and the maximum scenario, you'd be looking at 20 and 21% coverage respectively. And so as far as our economic opportunity analysis, we look at E-zone coverage of industrial tax lots as being a constraint because this is lot area that is not developable or is more difficult to develop due to the regulations that apply to the E-zones. So that's a factor that we factor into our economic opportunity analysis when we look at how much capacity we have for future job growth. And so we're doing a analysis of a number of different scenarios that look at how E-zones could be applied and how that would affect our capacity for future job growth in terms of the amount of land that's available. So we have a base scenario, which is basically just looking at, and it's important to know that E-zones are one of many constraints. That's not the only constraint on land development. We have a number of industrial sites that are brownfields. They have existing contamination that's left over from past development. When you have a site that's a brownfield, it makes it more difficult because you have to clean up that contamination before you can redevelop a site. So that's another factor that constrains industrial development. Other things that constrain industrial development are things like transportation deficiencies. If the road leading to your site is substandard, or if there's no road there, that makes it a less desirable site and a more difficult site to develop. So that's a constraint on development. Other constraints could be utilities. So if there's no sewer or water or power that's being provided to that site, that would constrain development there. That would be another thing that would be factored in. And there are other constraints that get factored in addition to natural resource protections. Um, and we're also looking at some community development factors as well too in this project, potentially some buffering requirements for industrial sites that adjoin residential sites. And if we were to require additional buffering of those sites, such as landscaping requirements or site orientation, that could also be looked at as a constraint because it might make industrial development more difficult. So these are a variety of different overlapping constraints, and we're looking at how all of these constraints together could affect these developable industrial sites that are otherwise buildable. And then we also are looking at some investment opportunities where we could make some investments in transportation infrastructure, in utility infrastructure, in cleaning up brownfields, other things that could promote industrial growth, and that could offset some of these constraints. And so these scenarios that we're building look at these different factors. It's how are the constraints changing on the industrial sites, and how are the investments changing on these sites, and how does that all work together to impact the amount of land that's available for development. So we start with a base scenario where it's just existing conditions, nothing changes. And then we have a number of different combinations of these different constraint changes and investment changes to see how that impacts land development. And so when we run these models to see how these different factors interplay, we find that there is adequate land to meet the industrial job growth projections that we have. So remember from a previous slide, we're looking at about 1,100 acres of demand for additional industrial land development. In the base scenario, we have a surplus of more than 200 acres of land. So it's not a big surplus, but we have enough land plus some extra land that's available to meet those growth scenarios. So we are able to meet what we expect to be the industrial growth over the next 20 years if we make no changes at all. And then if we combine these different scenarios, we could increase the amount of industrial land that's available or slightly decrease it. But all the different combinations that we've looked at so far would still keep us within the amount, still allow us to have enough land available to meet those projections. So any of our natural resource protection scenarios that we're reviewing, we could still meet those projections, assuming that we have investment targets and other things that are necessary to meet those projections. Um, and so that influences how we look at these different scenarios. There's other things to look at as well in terms of which scenario we advocate for as city staff as we move forward with this process. Just having a surplus is important, but it's not the end of the story because environmental zones also have impacts on existing industrial development as well too. Again, a third of that industrial job growth that we're projecting is going to be on existing industrial sites that are already developed, intensification within those sites, and the different E-zone protections can somehow in some ways constrain redevelopment of those sites because it can limit how much larger buildings can get or complicate the approval process when applicants want to redevelop their sites. So there's constraints on site development. There's also constraints on intensification within developed sites. And then we also, in addition to these mapping changes that we're looking at in this project and proposing, we're also proposing some amendments to the zoning code as well. So we have a number of amendments that apply to the chapter that applies to the environmental overlay zones. That's chapter 33-430. So there's an existing set of prohibitions on exterior work activities and hazardous material storage and use in the environmental zones. We're looking at making some adjustments to those prohibitions so that they wouldn't apply in the outer edge of the E zones in the area that's termed the transition area. This would mean that there are fewer areas where the existing development would be non-conforming, where E-zones are changing on sites, because generally non-conforming uses are allowed, even though the code says they're prohibited. It's complicated, but we are kind of liberalizing that area in the outer transition area of the E-zones. We're also looking at some changes to the lighting regulations. There are existing lighting regulations that apply in the E-zones that limit the spacing of lighting, prevent the shining of lights directly into the E-zones, and limit the amount of light that could be emitted by each light fixture that's built or that's installed in the E-zone. But the lighting regulations as currently applied are fairly archaic, and they're not really consistent with current practices and current technology that lighting that's being implemented. We have a set of lighting standards in our river environmental overlay zones that's much more modern and much more consistent with current lighting practices. So we are basically taking those lighting standards in the river overlay and copying them and putting a modified version of those into our environmental overlay zones to replace our old outdated lighting regulations. There are existing standards for right-of-way development within the E-zones that allow for roads to be developed. But as currently crafted, the standards are fairly restrictive, and they oftentimes result in road projects and frontage improvements being subject to environmental review. So we're looking at ways to modify those right-of-way development standards to make it less likely that a frontage improvement or road project would have to go through environmental review while still allowing for some or still requiring some mitigations for those impacts to the natural resources. So requiring some site enhancement options and some potentially tree replacements in ways that were not previously required. And then we're adjusting the tree removal limits. There are existing limits on how many trees can be removed from a site when applicants go through development. You can only remove trees if they're within 10 feet of a structure. We can only remove trees that are in E zones if they're within 10 feet of a proposed structure or proposed driveway or parking area. And so even even though those are the only trees that can be removed, a cap on the number of diameter inches of trees that can be removed. And so if you go beyond that limit, you would then trigger environmental review. But in addition to that, there are some tree replanting requirements on the site. So if you remove a tree, you have to plant a tree. And if you remove a large tree, you have to plant several trees. And so if you remove a number of large trees, then you have to plant a large number of replacement trees. And we run into a situation where the code prescribes so many trees that it's almost impossible to plant that many trees on a typical site. And so if somebody were to plant all those trees, you have overcrowding and high mortality of those trees that are planted on site. Or you might get into a situation where an applicant would be forced into environmental review because they are allowed to remove a whole bunch of trees, but there's no feasible way to replant them. So we're trying to right size that tree removal limit to make it more consistent with the number of trees that that could feasibly be replanted on a typical site. And then we are looking at the Columbia South Shore Plan District. So this is a subset of our project area. About a third of our project area is within a plan district that's known as the Columbia South Shore area. This is can be thought of as the part of the Columbia corridor that is located to the east of Interstate 205. This is a plan district that first was implemented in 1987. The code has been updated a couple times since then, but it's still, in terms of the environmental regulations that are contained within that plan district, they're fairly archaic and inconsistent with the regulations that we typically apply to environmental overlay zones and natural resources. They are very protective of natural resources, the Columbia South Shore E zones. But the code is difficult for applicants and staff to work with because it is so archaic in its construction. And there are some things that are particularly difficult, such as requirements to remove non-conforming pavement, even if your development that is proposed is outside of the E zones. So that can discourage site redevelopment. And in general, the way the code is administered is just kind of out of step with how environmental regulations are administered elsewhere in the city. So our proposal is to delete the environmental code chapters of the Columbia South Shore District and to replace that with the application of the normal E-zone code, chapter 33-430. So the E-zones in the Columbia South Shore, the regulations that apply to those E-zones would then become consistent with how E-zones are administered elsewhere in the city, which would make it easier for both applicants and city staff to process applications for new development. And we're looking at some mapping solutions to address that change, because going from the Columbia South Shore Plan District to the normal E-zone code in some ways would make the E-zones more permissive of new development. And so to avoid the loss of resources that are currently protected by making this change, we're doing some mapping solutions. We're adding an extra 25-foot buffer of E-zone, so making the buffers bigger around these features. And we're selectively applying protection zones to some features to avoid the rollback of natural resource protections in areas that are already in the protection zone. So we currently have a public draft that is out and reviewable by members of the public. And we refer to that first public review draft as the discussion draft. This draft is divided into 5 volumes. The first volume is primarily about policy, some history of natural resources, some information about how we inventory natural resources using that adopted natural resource inventory. And it's got an analysis that leads to the draft resource protection decisions of those 3 scenarios, the high, medium, and low scenarios. But again, that volume 1 is largely background information. Volume 2 contains site-specific natural resource protection plans. There are 3 documents that are part of volume 2, volume 2A, volume 2B, and volume 2C. And each of those documents has a different geographical focus. So if your main interest is to know how the E-zones are applied to a specific site that you're interested about, you can look up that resource site that applies to your location in one of those documents. It'll be a section that's 15 or 20 pages long that applies a specific natural resource protection decision to your site. And then volume 3 contains the zoning code amendments. So these documents are available on our project website. They're available for public review through November 10th. So you can submit comments on these documents through that date. The preferred way to submit comments is using the map app. And that's a URL that you can use to get to the map app. And I am going to show how to use that map app now. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen. And then I am going to bring up the map app and I'm going to show you how to use it. Give me just a moment and I will reshare my screen. Okay, so here's the map app. So when you click at the URL, it will bring you to this page as the landing page. You can use the link here to explore the project documents. This link will take you to the web location where those documents are located. This black box here with the blue comment button is where you can submit comments about the project. You can either submit comments about a specific site or just general comments about how we're doing the project. We've got a project timeline that talks about when we're planning on going through our hearing process, and we've got some more information about the project on the sidebar on the right-hand side here. If you want to find a specific site within the project area, you can type your address into the address bar, and it will zoom in on that site. And then you can turn on and off different features using the map controls in the upper right-hand corner of the map. There's 3 squares there. One of them allows you to turn on a different base map so you can see aerial imagery if you want, or you can go back to the regular base map, which is just schematic. The middle button is the layer manager. So what you see by default when you turn this map on is that medium scenario or climate resilient scenario. So that's on by default when you open this map. You can also turn on the existing E-zones so you can overlay them and see how they're potentially going to change in this project. So the existing E-zones will be shown as a solid color, whereas our E-zone proposals are shown as cross-hatching overlaid on top of those solid existing E-zones. So like I said, what you see by default is the medium scenario, but you can turn that off and you could see the high scenario if you wanted to, or you could see the low scenario. And you can see it's these little kind of eyeball-shaped icons that are next to the different layers that allow you to turn those layers on and off. And so if you're having trouble using that map, or if you have questions about how the E-zones are mapped on your site, if you select a site, the map will zoom in on that site. Again, you could use the address bar in the upper left-hand corner, or you can just click on the map to zoom in on a particular lot. What you'll see is that site will get outlined. That's the lot lines, or something roughly approximating the lot lines. And then you can request a site visit if you want, and project staff will then follow up with you to schedule a site visit. We can come out to your site, review what the draft E-zones look on that site, and review what the underlying natural resource mapping is that's being used to produce those draft E-zones, and potentially correct any errors or mistakes if there are any, or at least answer any questions about why the E-zones are mapped that way if there are no errors or mistakes. You can also just directly contact project staff by calling the phone number that's listed here, or by emailing the email that's listed here. Okay, so again, I'm going to stop sharing and go back to the presentation. And I will share one more time. So again, 5 project documents. You can use the map app to review the project proposals. And you can submit comments or request site visits or contact project staff through the map app. And so the next steps for this project are we will be reviewing all of the comments that are submitted, and we will propose edits and changes to the project documents, and a new draft will be, and again, we're accepting comments through November 10th. We'll be producing a new draft of these documents on December 8th, which will incorporate the revisions that we make based on public comment. And then starting early in 2026, we'll be going to the Planning Commission, which will hold public hearings, which will be another opportunity for members of the public to testify. You can testify directly to the Planning Commission at the hearings, or submit more written comments if you so desire. And then once we're done with Planning Commission hearings, we are expecting to move on to City Council hearings at some point later in 2026. And if all things go as planned, then new environmental overlay zone maps and new code would be implemented by October of 2026. So I encourage you, if you have any comments, questions, concerns, or want to schedule a site visit, please reach out and contact us. Again, ezone@portlandoregon.gov is the email address for myself and my colleagues here, and we will respond to any comments or questions that you have. You can also sign up for email updates on the project website if you want to stay informed about future changes and updates to the project and as we move forward with the hearing process. Thank you very much and have a nice day.